So now that we know a little bit about what the Spring framework is, let's talk about what Spring Boot is and why we need it. I always like to present a problem and then a solution, so let's start there. Unless you have years of experience with the Spring framework, it's really hard to create a new project and configure all of the moving parts. I would even argue that even if you do have all those years of experience, it's still not a lot of fun to do. XML was more of a problem in the past because of the ability to use Java configuration these days, but a large percentage of projects out there still use XML for configuration, and it's just not a lot of fun. Microservices. So I told myself that I would try and create a presentation on Spring Boot without using the buzzword that is microservices, and I just couldn't do it. Microservices are all the rage these days, and basically they're applications with a single responsibility that we should be able to get up off of the ground running really quickly. And that's obviously where Spring Boot makes its money. I mean, that's what it's built for. Remember when I said Spring developers are in demand? Well, they are. And if you're looking for a position today, you better have some understanding of what Spring Boot is and where it fits in, because more and more companies are using it, and a lot more people are downloading it, which we'll see in a future slide here. Okay, so that is why we need Spring Boot. So let's take a look at what Spring Boot is. So Spring Boot makes it really easy to get started with the Spring framework without having much knowledge about the inner workings of the framework. We looked at an overview of what it comes with, and as long as we have that basic knowledge, we can get up and running. Not only can we get up and running, but we can also do so quickly. And we can do it without all of the fuss and configuration of the Spring framework. Spring Boot is an opinionated on what it thinks configuration should look like. Again, this just makes it so we can get up and running really easily. It's also important to understand that while it's opinionated, it will not stand in your way if you need to change something. What I mean by that is this. If you're building a web application, Spring Boot assumes you need a servlet container and gives you an embedded version of Tomcat. Well, that's great, but what if you wanted to use another container? You can easily override that default configuration and use something else like Jetty. The Spring Boot CLI is a command line tool that can be used if you want to quickly prototype with Spring. It allows us to run Groovy scripts, which means they have the same familiar Java-like syntax without all of the boilerplate code. Spring Boot gives us an entry point so you know exactly where the application starts and what's going on. There's a main application class with a static void main method, so we know exactly where the app is starting and where it goes from there. I really don't like managing dependencies, and thankfully for us, Spring Boot gives us a collection of dependencies and correct versions to use by including them in something called a starter POM. Take our example of creating a Spring Web MVC project. There might be 10 different dependencies that a project like that needs to get up and going, and not to mention figuring out what versions of those projects play nice with each other. We no longer have to worry about that, and we can simply include a single Spring Boot starter web dependency. Spring Boot gives us some production-ready features to help us monitor and manage the application right out of the box. We can also create executable jars and simply run them anywhere, just by using java-jar and the name of the jar. This is especially important in the cloud and microservices world that we live in today. So there's that quote from Josh Long that's really popular, and it kind of sums up what Spring Boot is. Spring Boot lets you pair program with the Spring team. And all this means is that Spring provides a lot of sensible defaults and conventions that the Spring team has given to us. And so that makes our job real easy. As I said before, Spring Boot is really popular right now. In July of 2015, there was almost 1.65 million downloads in that month alone. So you can see it's been gaining traction, and it's really, really taken off. You can also use Groovy to develop your Spring applications. This is the infamous Spring application that fits in a tweet by Rob Winch. You can even shorten this code now even more these days by using the REST controller annotation, but it just shows you how quickly you can truly get a Spring app up and running. I promise you this does work, and we will build something like this in this course.